is 1914. Bay Ocean wasn't a church or even a spiritual community, but they were a people of faith who were searching for something more. They'd come to this narrow spit of sand off the coast of Oregon, seeking a version of heaven that was first conceived in the mind of Thomas Potter, a real estate developer who knew how to draw people. Potter told them about the views of the Pacific Ocean to the west and Tillamook Bay to the east. He sold them on a way of life, a resort that would eclipse Atlantic City and even the French Riviera. And the people came. Hundreds of families bought into the vision and purchased lots. Hundreds more rented tents to live in for a day or for a week, to live like they couldn't live for the rest of the year, and to make memories. Well, less than 10 years after his vision, signs of success were everywhere. Residents enjoyed tennis courts, a bowling alley, a 1,000-seat movie theater, and even an indoor natatorium, which featured a first-of-its-kind wave maker and a heated pool. And every Wednesday and Saturday, couples danced the sunset as they took in the beauty of the ocean, ribboned in pink and peach and orange. And the band played into the night as the waves shimmered in the moonlight and then crashed against the sand. Well, the problem was overlooked at first, which is understandable since the residents were too busy dancing to notice such a thing as the sea swallowing the sand. The Army Corps of Engineers said they could help. In order to calm the waters and change the current, they'd need to build 2 jetties, and it would cost a lot, but the government was willing to split the costs with the people. So the developers and the residents, the year-rounders and the summer folk, talked it over and wrung their hands and decided to build just 1 jetty and to see how that went. And so they did. And the band played on. Every Wednesday and Saturday, the couples twirled and the kids played in the sand. Less and less of it now since the 1 jetty had been built. The current changed, but the ocean seemed angered by the half measure, the 1 jetty instead of 2, and it started coming aggressively for Bay Ocean. But the band played on. Every Wednesday and Saturday, the couples twirled and the kids picked up pieces of the first house that fell into the sea. Eventually, the people started to panic and argued about who was to blame and debated about what should be done. What was once a disturbance had grown into a full-blown disaster. But the band played on. Every Wednesday and Saturday, the couples twirled as they could, while the ocean took the natatorium, the real waves sweeping away the man-made ones. And just 20 years later, the ocean turned the peninsula into an island without a tent, without a house, and without even a single resident. And finally, the band played no more. Well, in many ways, Bay Ocean became what its leaders had hoped. It was a place where people could escape life's problems, where they could focus on enjoyment, merriment, and memory-making. It was consumerism at its best. Unfortunately, cultures marked by consumerism are unable to differentiate between disturbance and disaster, between what's undesirable and what's unacceptable. As long as people feel like things are okay, then the band plays on, and decisive action is avoided. While the tide swallowed the beach, dances continue to be held twice a week. The story of Bay Ocean holds many lessons for the church. The American church as we know it is dying. It is being swallowed by the tides of consumerism, and the erosion has been steady for a while now. According to Barna, over the past 10 years, church attendance in America has dropped from 48% to 29% of the population, and those numbers are pre-COVID. But our problem is not a virus, it's our foundation. It's the belief that the church can thrive on a foundation other than Jesus-style disciple-making. Together, we've been blinded by consumerism. We've believed that 1 jetty solutions such as better worship, better programs, and better preaching are a better way to make disciples than what Jesus modeled. We've lost our way. So what can be done? Embracing a 2 jetty solution isn't easy. It costs a lot and demands even more. Any church who wants to make disciple-making their core mission must build a foundation based on Jesus' example. There's a lot that can be said about this, but I'm excited to share with you a proven and effective process for turning the tide and making disciple-making the core mission of the church. The process starts with a disciple-making leader. In order for a church to have disciple-making as its core mission, the pastor must have disciple-making as his core mission. He can't just celebrate it, delegate it, or automate it. He has to demonstrate it. If the pastor doesn't personally and relationally make disciples, then there's little hope of it ever spreading to others. But when a pastor is the visible example of what he hopes others will become, it's powerful. Yet we know that for many pastors, becoming a disciple maker is a great challenge. Most have simply never had any training in disciple making. But the lack of training and experience aren't the only obstacles. Many must also overcome past hurts, personality preferences, and low emotional reserves in order to become a disciple maker. Others must shift paradigms from seeing themselves primarily as a shepherd to seeing themselves primarily as a trainer of disciples. Many pastors need help in the process. The truth is, there's no substitute for a living example. And when a pastor has someone to model what it looks like to disciple others, they're able to learn much more quickly. When they're on their own, however, most simply don't make it, not because of obstacles, but because of well-worn paths to lesser goals. It's worth the effort, though. God has called us to live great things, not simply to speak about them. Pastors who become relational disciple makers are surprised by how fun it is. My team and I are used to having front row seats as pastors discover a vibrance they'd never known before. Even pastors who are nearing the end of their careers are amazed to see God transform lives and raise up new disciple makers through Jesus-style disciple making. It starts with one. It always starts with one. And when the fire is white hot, pastors tell us they will make disciples long after they retire. They will make disciples until the day they die. But a disciple-making leader alone isn't enough to establish disciple-making as the core mission of the church. The second step in the process is to form a core team of disciple makers. I'm talking here about a team, not a group. And that's a big difference. Groups are common in our consumeristic culture. Churches are full of them. Consumers join groups, programs, and events to meet their own needs. But a team happens when individuals join together to pursue a purpose greater than themselves. In fact, teams cannot fulfill their mission without one another. I've recently published an ebook with Discipleship.org that's a deep dive into how to build a core team of disciple makers. CORE is an acronym which stands for Common Vision, Owned Individually, Relationally Resilient, and Endurance to the End. A core team wasn't my idea, though. It was Jesus's. He stepped away from the crowds in order to pour into the few. Each of the 12 disciples were on a journey of becoming like Jesus, but together they were a team committed to the mission of Jesus. The result was a team that couldn't be moved off of its mission, and it endured to the end. Jesus' team is the reason we know about him today. Imagine what would have happened if he'd only focused on the masses. Well, in churches, a core team helps the disciple-making leader maintain clarity of the vision, especially when distractions or disaster threaten the church's direction. Establishing the core team isn't easy. Download the free ebook, The Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture, to learn how you can develop such a team. Finally, no church is able to develop a team of disciple makers without having disciple-making metrics. Simply put, we measure what matters. Disciple-making requires measurement that's different from bodies, bucks, and baptisms. If we only measure those traditional metrics, then we will never really know whether our disciple-making efforts are effective. Disciple-making metrics maintain the integrity of the vision. They help ensure that the mission is lived out, not just talked about. They are how disciple-making leaders measure where the rubber meets the road. In addition to traditional metrics, churches should track those baptized over the course of 5 years. After year 1, how many are still in the church, and how many are being discipled? After 3 years, add the question, how many of those are discipling others? After 5 years, add the question, how many are in church leadership? These questions will help your church better understand how well you are reaching the lost and growing them to maturity. More broadly, measure how many disciple-making chains of 3 or more generations emerge in your church year over year. This metric helps you discern whether you are making disciple makers or just disciples who don't make others. After all, no church can be satisfied with dead-end discipling. Finally, help the congregation develop measurable missional habits. These practices are to be done outside the church, such as serving someone, having a gospel conversation, or eating with a non-Christian each week. Metrics matter, but don't forget the first 2 steps in the process are a disciple-making leader and a core team of disciple makers. When we combine those with disciple-making metrics, disciple-making can become the core mission of your church. In closing, the true story of Bay Ocean confirms that hindsight is 20/20 and that insight follows experience. Imagine how differently Bay Ocean's leaders would have responded if they'd known that just building 1 jetty would make the problem worse, but building 2 would have solved it. When it comes to disciple-making in the church, Navigators Church Ministries brings the benefit of our experience to you. Our team is spread across the nation and walks alongside over 1,000 church leaders each year to help them establish disciple-making as the core mission of their church. What we do is simple yet powerful. We help pastors become relational disciple makers. We help churches form a core team of disciple making. And finally, we help them establish effective disciple making metrics. Together, these help churches go all in on disciple making. If you're ready to begin working on a 2-jetty solution to establish disciple making as the core mission in your church, we'd love to help. Start by downloading our free ebook, The Foundation of a Disciple-Making Culture. Then email us for a free consultation on the current reality of disciple-making in your church. Then together we'll work with you to build a 2-jetty solution that will stand up to the tides of our culture.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Bobby Harrington, and I have the privilege of being the point leader for discipleship.org. I'd like to welcome you all here today for this Christmas and holiday season. In fact, you'll notice I have a picture behind me from my hometown where I live. Franklin, Tennessee is essentially a suburb of Nashville. And a year ago, my family was downtown and we took this picture and I thought, this is a great picture. It's the Dickens Christmas that we have here every year. So you'll notice that behind me. Unfortunately, we can't have it this year because of COVID-19. I'm really pleased to have Justin Gravitt with us. Justin, I just have a tremendous respect and affection for Justin and the work that he does with Navigator Church Ministries. And I'm so glad that you had the opportunity to hear Justin in his TED-style talk that we just went through. So Justin's with me. Justin, you want to bring greetings? Wave at everybody.
Hello, good to see you guys. Good to be with you, Bobby.
So we're going to jump into a conversation around the things that Justin was talking about. But before we do that, I want to make sure everybody knows about the chat box. And we are monitoring that chat box. And our own Gary Tanner is going to be making sure that we get the dominant questions or important questions that come up and that we can address them. So we're glad to have you here and we want to engage with you. So make sure you put those questions in the chat box. All right. Well, I want to jump in with the challenge that Justin presented to us. And that statement is that American Christianity is dying. And he quoted the Barna stats. I've been looking at these same stats, and I do think they're distressing. Is it fair to say, Justin, though, let me just throw this to you, that the American church is dying?
So, no. So I was very careful in the video, right? So I said the American church as we know it is dying. And so I do believe that is the case. The model that we have for the American church and what normally comes into our mind when we think of church, I mean, it is trending downward. And if it was a patient, the prognosis wouldn't be good.
Yeah, that's right. And you quoted the stat from 48% to 28% in terms of church attendance. But even amongst those attending church, the world seems to be out discipling the church. You talked about kind of being blinded by Sunday programming. Talk to us about that and about these foundations that we've
Yeah.
relied on that are other than disciple making.
Yes. So most pastors, move through seminary and move into a church, and their hopes and dreams are built around what they've experienced in the past, right? And so, for many of those pastors, churches were booming in the 80s and 90s, and in the early 2000s, we began to see a real shift. And what a lot of pastors do is try to recover that. And so they're trying to recover the numbers of attendance. They're trying to recover, the memories that they have of, super engaging worship with lots of people. And there's some churches where that's still the case. But there's a lot more churches out there that are declining, or at least not advancing or not growing at the rate of their community that they're in. And so compared to the community, they are in fact declining, even if they're holding steady. And so part of the issue that my book taps into is this idea of foundations, right? And so what is the foundation of church and what should it be, right? And so one of the things that I explore in there is this belief that the foundation of Jesus' church should be Jesus and his model of how to make disciples. And we have chosen a model, or inherited a model is probably more accurate. We've inherited a model that is different from that, a model that is rooted around and centered around Sunday worship experience, and counting numbers and counting bodies and all that sort of thing. And none of that's wrong. I want to be real clear. None of that's wrong. And I'm happy that we have it for those that it serves really well. But there's a whole host of people that it's not serving well. And we can see that reflected in the Barna numbers.
That's, in the chat box, there's a question, Justin, what have you seen as the one jetty solutions pastors and churches attempt? You kind of answered that, but maybe just explicitly, what are some things that people are doing that are not really good solutions?
Right. So the one jetty solutions I see most often are trying to do more and do better, right? And so we need better worship. We need more people. We need better programming, or we need more programming. And so those solutions really are trying to strike at the problem of attendance and getting people back into the church or engaged in the church, which again, the motivation is great. The methodology, or the way they're trying to solve that problem, I don't think it fits with what Scripture teaches, and it certainly is not effective right now in our culture. And so the one jetty solutions often make problems worse, like it did in Bay Ocean. And so when we double down on things that aren't very effective, then we have an opportunity cost at what we're not doing, right? And so what we're not doing is Jesus-style disciple making, and we're not forming foundations for disciple making. In fact, Bobby, in part of the book, I explore kind of the motivations that people have, even in exploring disciple making and trying to make that a part of their church. And for many, the disciple making efforts that they have are still one jetty solutions, because the motivation they have for it is not to make disciples the way that Jesus did. It's to solve the problem that they have in their church, whether it's attendance or whether it's a backdoor problem, of people leaving the church, to clarify that terminology. And so that's the result of one jetty solutions, is we just see the 10-year trend from Barna is church attendance continues to decline.
Another Barna stat that ties in with what Justin is saying is they published this report earlier in the year, the state of the church. And one of the things that I noticed that really stood out to me is the number of people in the United States. By the way, we have several Canadians on here, I've noticed in the chat box. Way to go, Canadians. The numbers in Canada and I know this because I am a Canadian, uh, um, the Canadians are actually ahead of us in the decline. And of course, the Europeans were ahead of us all with that, going back to the 60s and the 70s. But the number of people in the United States who claim to be practicing Christians, again, they didn't define, like, how do you define that? It was just, do you claim to be a practicing Christian? 2009, it was 50%. At the beginning of 2020, it had dropped to 25%. So that's pretty close to your 28% church attendance. And so it's not just that what we're doing isn't working, it's that the world is out discipling the church. So talk to us, Justin, about how is it that Jesus-style disciple making is going to be more effective? Like, what is it about Jesus' method that causes people like you and me to say it's more effective?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I've seen in my own life and in the life of others that I've worked with over the past 20 years is that Jesus-style disciple making is about changing who we are from the inside out. And it's about changing our lifestyle to reflect his. And so it's more than, knowing certain tenets or learning a certain way of doing things. It's really about remodeling or retransforming, changing who we are, so that the very foundation of where our life is aimed is different. The foundation of the mission that we have for living is different. And so in the video, when I mentioned that many pastors say, man, this has changed me, and I'm going to be doing this until the day they die. I mean, I've worked with pastors that have been in the ministry for 40, 50 years. And, they say these things to me because even though they've been faithfully following Jesus for that amount of time, their DNA begins to change, and it changes to viewing life and ministry, but not just ministry. Their whole life is oriented around, all right, how can I be a disciple and how can I make disciples? And so when that change happens, then we have somebody whose DNA is really impacted by Jesus-style disciple making, as opposed to, just learning something, right? And one of my key leaders now, after helping him for about a year, and we were talking about Jesus-style disciple making, I was meeting with him every other week for an hour and a half. We moved through the master plan of evangelism together, and at the end of it, he wanted to move it into his church. How can we get this going in the church? And I said, well, I'm sorry, we can't. We're not ready yet. And he said, what do you mean? He's a little frustrated with me. He said, what do you mean? We've been doing this for 10 months now. And, you said once we went through this, I said, no, I said that as Jesus changes your heart, then we'll be ready. And I said, this is a hard conversation, but I see that you understand it up here, but I'm not sure I've seen much change here. And I said, is that fair? And he reflected and he said, yeah, I think it is. And so we kept at it for about 3 more months, and then the Spirit did make that change. And now he's been getting after it ever since.
Yeah, that's good. By the way, Walter, we are going to go through the 4 core ideas that, or the acronym that Justin develops. Before we move on from this, in terms of Jesus' method, Snowbeard says, is Jesus' discipleship a New Testament phenomena, or does it have an Old Testament basis? Why don't you tackle that, and I'll help you out afterwards.
Great question.
I don't mean that it didn't come out right. I want to say some things about that too.
I need all the help I can get. So the Great Commission to me starts in Genesis, right? And so the first commandment that God gives to man is to be fruitful and multiply. Now, as we walk through Genesis, we see that people were fruitful and multiplied, but they didn't keep it spiritual and physical. So they did it physically, and then God was grieved. And I'm sure all of us on the call know Noah, the story of Noah, right? So God starts over, in a sense, with Abram, and he gives this promise to Abram that if Abram follows God, that he will make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And a fun study to do is to trace that promise generationally from Abram all the way through the end of Genesis, and you will see 2 things. You'll see that God passes the promise to each child of promise, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way through to Joseph. And then the human Father confirms it to the Son. And so it's fun to trace through. You can see pieces of that promise being carried all the way through the Old Testament. Jesus is a fulfillment of it and opens it up to people like me and probably most of us on this call that weren't, physically Jewish from that heritage. And in Galatians 3:29, it says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And so that promise is the one that they're referring to. And so Jesus-style disciple making was Jesus carrying that through and showing us how to do it. And then Paul picks it up, Peter picks it up, and it continues today. So, Bobby, what would you add?
No, again, I'm agreeing with you, and I wish I'd worded that a little bit differently. But one of the things I feel very convicted about is Deuteronomy 6, which is called the Shema. And in the time of Jesus, Jewish people said it every day, and that goes like this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. This is Moses. Teaching this, these commandments that I give you today, teach them to your children. Talk about them when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Bind them as symbols on your hands, on your foreheads, and on the door frames of your houses. And really this idea of talking about the commands of God when you lie down, when you get up, that is relational discipleship in Deuteronomy 6. And that actually is the best succinct description of the methodology that Jesus used. And I would argue that it is the core, most effective methodology today. It's life on life, helping people understand and assimilate truths and showing them how to live it out in the context of relationships where there's discussion. So, I just think that it's the reason we got to get back to it is there's nothing as effective as what Jesus did, but it's time consuming. It's time consuming. It involves a lot of love, which is why Jesus emphasized love and why the New Testament does. And it's not just this microwave, put up a sign. I planted a church in the mid to late 90s. And back then, you would start a church with we called it the Big Bang model, because you did mail outs and, marketing and cultivating relationships. And you announced, we're going to start meeting at the school, and, a whole bunch of people show up. Well, you can still do some of that in some contexts, especially if a church planter has been effective at certain things. But by and large, that's not the kind of thing that works anymore. It's life on life, relational focus, kind of like what Jesus. It's not kind of like, it's like Jesus did with his disciples. So let me get to this, Justin. You said that a pastor has to set the example. That it starts with the pastor. He must have disciple making as his own personal core DNA. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So it's kind of like I was saying earlier that, when pastors get that as their core DNA, they don't just see the church through the lens of disciple making. They see all of life through the lens of disciple making. And it's difficult for pastors because a lot of times they haven't had the training. But I'm working with a pastor now who's been in the ministry for 40 years. And his struggle right now is, how does he love people outside of being pastor to them? And so we're talking about that because most of his engagement with people, not only in the church, but the time he has outside the church, is people relating to him as pastor, as opposed to relating to him as Phil. Let's say that's not his name, but and so when they don't relate to him just as a guy, it's hard for him to know, how do I love people that way? And if he doesn't get that, then how can he pass that on to others? And so really we have to start in the life of the pastor. And, another common challenge pastors face is being engaged with non-believers in a real way. And so one of the questions I'll often ask them is, when's the last time a non-Christian invited you to do something socially? And I ask that question because we can't manipulate that. right? So if I ask the question, when's the last time you talked to your non-Christian friend? Well, he could think of his neighbor that he talks, over the fence with, that his neighbor tries to avoid, right? But, gets caught up. And so that neighbor wouldn't call the pastor a friend. But when somebody is initiating with us socially, well, that's what friends do, right? We can't manipulate that. And so it's
Yeah,
those
that's a
sorts of
great metric.
lifestyles. Yeah.
I really like that metric. Hey, one of the questions in the chat box from Dave in Vermont is the prerequisites that are worth attending to before directing energy toward a disciple-making movement. And I think you're talking about that right now. You got to be what you want others to be.
Exactly.
And so it starts with the person who's the leader. If somebody's joining and they're not a pastor, though, don't you agree that they can start a disciple-making focus in their life, even if they're
Yes.
not the lead pastor? But if you want to switch a church, the pastor has to lead the way if you're switching a church.
Yeah,
But
I
if you're
agree with
just
that.
switching a family or a ministry, who's ever, like, even in your own life, like, we got to be, it starts with us. That's the prerequisite.
Right. Yes, I agree with that. And if you are a layperson of a church where the pastor is not on board with disciple making, the best thing you can do is love your pastor well and model disciple making in your own life and ministry. And so if you're leading a life group or a small group, find somebody in there to disciple. As you are engaged in whatever else you're engaged in the church, love the pastor well, show him that you're trustworthy and that you are with him and not against him, and then model the impact that disciple making can have with those that you're ministering to. And, I've had a couple guys that do that, and the pastor comes to them and says, hey, I need to know more about what you're doing because I'm seeing the fruit that's coming out of your ministry in this part of the church, and we need more of it. In fact, in one instance, the pastor came to that layman and said, I see what you're doing, and I want to know if you'll disciple me. And so that's not common. We don't want to expect that. But what we can do is love the pastor well and model relational disciple making with those that you're engaged in the church.
Now, your second principle is that so the pastor has to make it his core DNA. And what we're saying is, if you're not a pastor, wherever you have leadership, and maybe that's just your own life, maybe it's your, just with a few friends, you got to start it. And then you build a core team. Some people call it a guiding coalition, but it's a core team. What do you mean by that? Like who's involved in that core team? Talk to us about if you're a senior pastor, but then if you're not a senior pastor, who's your core team?
Yeah. Yep. So for senior pastors, we want to think about a cross section of the church. And so on the core team, you want to have both genders represented. You want to have generations represented that are represented in your church. And you also want to have ethnic diversity that reflects the reality of your church. And so you want to invite those sorts of people. But that's not the primary. Those are secondary considerations. The primary considerations are people that are faithful, available, and teachable. And so again, that's that FAT acronym. If you've been around disciple making very long, you've probably heard it before. And so it doesn't matter how mature they are in the faith. What matters is, are they currently faithful, available, and teachable? And if I'm trying to change the culture of a church, then I also need to add, are they influencers in the church? Now, be very careful. We don't want a team of just positional leaders. So I don't want a core team of just my elders or my elders and a few other ladies. We don't want that, because the problem is the average person in the church will look at that team and say, oh yeah, disciple making for the leaders. I get that. And, not for me because I'm not a leader. But what happens when we have a cross section, then people have to deal with those that they've known in the church for a long time that are being transformed, and they can see it. And so we've had example, hey, what's going on with you? You just seem different. Oh, well, I don't know if you know, I'm on this team and, God's really changing me. And I'm really realizing that this making disciples thing, it's something I can do. I never thought I could do it before. And now that energy and momentum begins to spread through the culture of the church. And so that's why it's real important that we have, that cross section.
That's good. By the way, Snowbeard in the chat box
You with me? Did I freeze?
Wrote something. He said, I respectfully submit it doesn't have to begin with the pastor, which is what we're saying. That's exactly right. Now, for a church, that's going to be the best if the pastor leads the way and then builds this team that Justin talks about. Justin, back to a church, you talk about key metrics. What are some, and you mentioned them, like tracking the baptisms and retentions and the number of converts who were in leadership a few years later. What, maybe do you want to say anything more about those metrics and why is that important?
Yeah. So we measure what matters, and what we elevate, we celebrate, right? And so is celebrate in the culture of the church. And so we need to be real careful about the things that we're tracking and we're talking about, not only with our staff, but also with the broader church. A couple weeks ago, I was on a webinar with you, Bobby, and Steve McCoy, and Steve's pastor down in Sarasota, and he shared how, they celebrate 3 generations in their church. And so when there's 3 generations that emerge, they celebrate that, on Sunday mornings. And so that's a great thing to do. I encourage disciple making stories to be communicated regularly. But those metrics that I mentioned in the video, all right, churches track baptisms. A lot of them do already. So that's a great thing. We need to celebrate baptisms, but that's not the finish line. That's in some ways the starting point, right? And so how do we start with those new believers, and what are we going to do with them? And then what do we measure a year later? Well, are they even still in the church? Hopefully. And if they're in the church, how many of them are being discipled by one of our leaders or somebody who is a disciple maker in the church? Because if we're going to measure that, then we're going to pay attention at the front end. Okay, we got 5 people that were baptized this month. Who's going to disciple them, right? It's going to change the way we behave. And then after 3 years, how many of those people are discipling somebody else? And maybe after 5 years, how many of those people are leading in the church in some way or ready for that? And so if we did that year by year, I think it would radically change not only what we do in the church, but our effectiveness as a church.
No, that's good. Well, Justin, in your book, and by the way, there's a quick link to the book below the main screen there, where you can just get that book and download it. We really commend that to everybody. In the book, Justin has an acronym, CORE, and that's for core vision, owned individually, relationally resilient, and endurance, or to endure to the end. Let's talk about each of those real quickly, Justin. What is this common vision?
Yep. So the common vision is, where are we going and why are we going there? Right? We need to get on the same page on that as a team. And so that's another concept I unpack a lot in the book, is the difference between a team and a group. And there's huge differences. And if we're not a team, so one of the things that distinguishes a team is we're on a mission together, and we all know what that mission is. And that mission is not just my mission, as one individual of the group. We see it together and we understand it together, and we're moving there together. And so if we don't have that common vision, then it's real hard to be a team, because, my teammate over here shows up because he wants to learn more about disciple making. Person over here shows up because they're interested in more fellowship or connections in the church, or, there's a million different reasons somebody might show up to that. But if we're a team, then we're all moving in the same direction towards that common vision or common goal. In disciple making and in the churches, as a lead pastor, what I want to help this team get a common vision around is, how do we develop and become disciple makers? First of all, how do I become a disciple maker? Because that's what Jesus asked me to do. But also, how do I impact the culture of the church? And what I want the core team to understand and to, have common vision around is, the culture we form in this team is the only thing we have to export to the broader culture of the church. And so if we want a culture of disciple making in the church, then we have to be real careful about what we're doing here and why we're doing it here as a team. So that's kind of common vision. The O is owned individually. A team is only as strong as its weakest link. And there are ways that as Americans, we relate to one another, and we relate politely and courteously, that you might think I'm really on board with what we're doing here as a team. And I'm not really on board. I'm on board to the degree that I respect the pastor and I want to support him, but I'm not going to be a disciple maker because, I really like to teach academic style classes in the church. And I believe that's what I need to do. Right. And so if we don't own it at an individual level that I need, and each person on the team has to own it, and to the degree that they will fight for it. And so that's developing, developing that ownership. And the lead pastor has to help as the leader of the team, has to come alongside each one in a relational way outside those team meetings and say, hey, how's it going for you on here? Where are you struggling? And sometimes they're going to be struggling in the process, and the pastor will need to take an hour and have a conversation over the phone or over coffee or something, and kind of unpack those struggles that each person's having. So that's the C, the O, the R. You want to jump in? Let me keep going.
No. Keep going. This is good.
Okay. So the R then is relationally resilient. And so, the first part is they see the vision. Second part is they're moving towards it, relational ownership. And then the relationally resilient, what happens in team settings is a lot of times there'll be somebody that is lagging behind or, isn't doing what they need to be doing. They're engaging at a half level. And that's a real key point for pastors, is because what we generally want to do is just kind of, we start by encouraging, which is a good place to start. But then if it doesn't change, then we just kind of say, oh, well. But when we do that, that lowers the expectation, the level of the whole team. And so pastors and teams have to be willing to have hard conversations together and say, hey, you guys said that you wanted to be committed to this, but, I'm getting emails an hour before saying, hey, pastor, sorry, I'm not going to make it. And which it could be okay. It could be a great reason. But as a team, we don't know why you're not here. And so can we respect each other enough to say, and the pastor to ask the hard question, hey, where were you? I know you couldn't make it. What happened? Oh, well, I decided to go to a game with my buddy. Okay. Well, maybe that's a great reason if your buddy's a non-Christian, but you already have a commitment here. And so can you honor the team enough to at least say, hey, guys, my non-Christian friend invited me to a game. I want to be respectful of you guys and the commitment we have. How do you think I should handle that? And then the team can handle it together, right? But when we just say, yeah, I'm out, then that doesn't communicate that. And so relationally resilient is a willingness to move in and to have those hard conversations with the people on the team. And the people on the team sometimes have to have them with each other. And so some of it's conflict resolution, but often I say, and disciple making moves right through the valley of our weakness. And so whatever our weakness is, we're probably going to be confronted with it as a disciple maker. And we have to be willing to support each other as we go through that. And so when teams are relationally resilient, they move through those hard things together, and they come out on the other side a lot stronger. Finally, endure to the end. So in these teams, what happens is towards the end, people have changed a lot. They've been moving outside of what they know and what they normally do. And they get kind of worn down and tired before the process has ended. And they want to go back to what it was before. And the pastor at that moment is normally really excited and feels like things are really going well. And so it's interesting. What happens is the pastor feels like things are awesome. The team members are like, oh man, I'm not sure I can do this anymore. I've tried it and I'm just not sure it's working. I think the pastor might've been wrong about me, or I think I'm just not suited for this sort of thing. And they're thinking about quitting. And so the pastor has to come in and really understand that they have to help these team members even more at this point in the process than ever before. And so together, the team picks each other up, the pastor leads in that, and they endure to the end until that transformation process feels like they're through it, right? That when they think about going back, they don't want to go back anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the endure to the end. And unfortunately, I've seen teams that move through the first three really well, and then the pastor and they don't encourage one another well, and it just kind of falls apart. And it's a sad thing because they've come so far. But that's the core of teams.
Justin, as you described this process, by the way, I just commend you for the outline that you've given. Just so everybody knows, it's also consistent with what has been learned about organizational change. There's a famous book called Leading Change, and Justin's laid out a process with the mind of Christ and around disciple making that follows each of those elements. Justin, one of the questions we've got in the chat box, and I see this question often, and it's somebody describing a situation where that's not happening. This change process, it's not happening, and they're frustrated because they don't think it can happen in their church. Here's the question from guest 8981. The issue I have experienced is that you are leading a disciple-making team and the church is not supportive. It is counterproductive to invite people to attend the church. This leads to the thought of going with a home church model. Thoughts?
I struggle with that. And I empathize with it at the same time, right? So when we want something and are convinced of something so much, it's easy to get frustrated with people around us that feel like they're in the way of that. But, the church is important to Christ's heart, and it should be important to ours, right? And so as we engage with the church, we have to around Luke 6, where Jesus says to the disciples, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I do?" I mean, I think Jesus is pretty frustrated at that point. And he doesn't just say, "Forget it, guys, I'll find somebody else." He continues with them, and, it's a process for all of us. And so I'm just encouraged, we got to hang in with those that God has called us to hang in with. And those are the people in the church. And so it doesn't mean we can't also invest in others who aren't in that particular church. But I don't, it's hard to get on board with that line of thinking of just throwing it away, right?
Well, yeah, and Justin and I would both agree. We just hate the frustration that 89, 81, that you're showing there. And I hope you've had a chance to sit down in a non-threatening way with the senior pastor and talk through those frustrations and try to work it out. It can be really frustrating though, and we think that obviously at the one hand, you want to try to work it out, but you also got to be somebody who's making disciples. Another question here, Justin, and we're going to try to get real specific with specifics how to. For a pastor seeking to own their own need to learn and live into discipleship or disciple making, where would you point them as a starting point? Books, practices? In other words, somebody's just wanting to start this off. So let me throw that to you, Justin. And
so I'm assuming the question is from somebody who's currently a disciple. So they have a relationship with Jesus already and are walking with him and want to learn more about disciple making. So if that's the case, the master plan of evangelism is kind of the gold standard on a principled level.
Yeah, by the way, we have the that book summarized in a free ebook on discipleship.org. It's called Revisiting the Master Plan, where Robert Coleman talks about that just as a free resource there. I'm sorry, keep going, Justin.
Yeah, that's great. The other one I use a lot is The Alongsider by Bill Mowry.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous resource. It's a little bit workbooky, but the questions are insightful and not just the kind that crank-a-blanks is what I like to call them, right? There's only one obvious answer and you got to fill it in. But that is a great resource to help you with kind of the skills of disciple making. And so that's one I've used a lot. And for pastors, the one that discipleship.org just partnered with him publications on disciple making culture. which is more of a cultural look, but it also has enough notes in there around what it means to be a disciple-making leader that could really be helpful for you.
Yeah, I recommend that book. I would also recommend just kind of a biblical basis, David Young's book, King Jesus and the Beauty of Obedience-Based Discipleship, which is basically an exposition of Matthew 28:18 through 20. Well, Justin,
Let me add one more, Bobby.
yeah,
Organic Discipling by McCollum, I think it is. It's probably, if you're a everyday disciple maker or even a pastor, as far as in a disciple making relationship, it gets really detailed and really helpful. There's a review of that on my website, justingravitt.com, if you want to check that out too. But
okay, so let's get real specific with some how-tos. What are some things that you'd start off with specific how-tos, Justin?
yeah, so again, selection, right? When you pick your team, you want to go through the things I already mentioned. But when you invite, you want to emphasize the commitment, not the opportunity, right? So what you recruit them to is what you recruit them for. And so if you recruited them to something that's really going to help them, they're walking in thinking that. If you're recruiting them to something that you need their help in, because you're trying to develop disciple making in the church, then they're going to come as a servant. We emphasize the high commitment when we invite. And for people that are like, well, I don't know, I'm already doing so much. A lot of pastors will say, well, I'd really like you to consider making this the primary thing that you do. And if you need to step back from some of the other things you're doing in the church, then I want to help you figure out how to do that. And that shows the priority. Another common question I get is, how big should this team be? And the way I walk through that question with pastors is, the team needs to be somewhere between 4 and 12 people. And the determining factor is, how many people are you able to have a 10-minute conversation with once a month, right? Because what I want each pastor to do is, at least once a month, I need you to check in with each member of your team outside of your team meeting. And I need you to just say, hey, how's it going for you on this team? Are you struggling? Are you encouraged? What do you think of how it's going? And most of the time, most people on the team are going to be doing fine. But frequently, there will be someone on the team that is struggling with something. And then you need to have the time available to open up to them and say, well, I'm really sorry you're going through this, or I understand that tension. Why don't we sit down sometime in the next week or so and kind of have a bigger conversation about that? And so for some pastors, they have the time and availability to do that with 10 people, 12 people. If they have a co-leader alongside them, another disciple maker, again, need to be modeling it first, with them on the team, then they can split up and say, hey, why don't you take this 5 and check in? I'll check in with this 5. And it moves that way. So that's really how we determine size for these teams. Then the other question I get a lot is, well, what are we doing? What are we doing on this team? And that's a curriculum content question. In the hands of a disciple maker, they can use pretty much any quality curriculum and get to where you want to go.
Hey, Justin, let me just jump in there because in the chat box, guest 7934 asked to talk about the difference between having classes with good content and making disciples, and that's what you're talking about. So explain that just a little bit more.
Yeah. So again, classes are going to be an educational framework. If we have common vision together, then we know why we're here. And we're here to become disciple makers. And we're here to help establish a culture of a team that we're going to export to the greater, the church culture at large, which then will impact the culture outside the church, right? That's the vision. And so our framework is oriented around obedience, like you talked about. So whatever curriculum we're using, we want to be talking about, okay, well, so how are you going to apply what we talked about? How are you going to apply that in your life? And so, again, lots of curriculums can get the job done. I use most frequently the Alongsider, and that's very discussion oriented. And my goal in the Times is not to cover the chapter, it's to have a conversation about the concepts that the chapter brings up. And so once we have a conversation about the concepts, we need to turn it back to ourselves and say, well, how are we doing with that? And so, in some of the chapters, it's basic stuff like prayer, or spending time in the Word. Everybody's thought about it a million times, but we want to get honest in our team and say, well, let's just share what our prayer life looks like week to week. And you can't really tell me that you're praying all the time. I want to know more detail than that. And so we get down to the weeds of what we're doing. And then we ask, okay, well, what is the Spirit telling you that you need to do anything differently in light of our conversation, in light of what the chapters talked about? How do you need to respond to what the Holy Spirit's saying? And then we set a measurable goal that we communicate to one another, and then we can help keep each other accountable on. And we do that for every step through the process. And so early on in the process, it's about helping the team become disciple makers. Later on, it shifts to helping them help somebody else become a disciple and a disciple maker. But we want to be oriented around application and obedience in this team. So it isn't just a classroom academic thing, because I think Christians, we don't need to know anymore. We need to apply what we know.
That's good. That's very good. Well, we're going to pause for a second. We want everybody to know about what I think is the best way to really wrap your whole mind and heart around Jesus-style disciple making. So I want everybody to watch this short video. And on the other side, I'm going to have a really important question that I'm going to ask Justin to answer for us.
Hey guys, you can have immediate access to all the material from the Holistic Disciple Making Intensives, and you can purchase the course for personal use at a time that's best for you. It's called our Holistic Disciple Making Masterclass and Certification. And with it, you get access to all the in-depth discussions in video and in written form, online assessments, and you get Discipleship.org's certification. So for more information, please click the tab below.
So I just want to encourage everybody with the material in that course. We're really excited about it. My thing is, if every church in North America had their key leaders go through it, it'd literally change the way Christianity is in this country. We'd all be disciples making disciples. So Justin, here's my last question for you. Close us out by telling us a story of how God blessed you in your efforts to help someone make the transition to what you've been talking about.
Yeah. So let me tell you about my friend, Pastor Jason. So met Jason 3 years ago. He's a guy that's been in ministry for about 20 years, a lead pastor, was struggling and had on his heart that there had to be more. There had to be more than what he was doing and leading Sunday morning services and preaching sermons. He wasn't seeing the transformation that he wanted to see. And it bothered him. It plagued him. And he said, Justin, I hear you can help me. And what I want is to make disciples. And I said, okay, I can help. And so we started to walk through some of these concepts and the principles that we've been talking about on this call. And over time, he's become a disciple maker. And so he's making disciples. He's seeing generations of disciples flowing out from his life. And now he's started this team in his church where the people are coming together around disciple making, some everyday people, and they're being transformed. And he said to me not long ago, he said, Justin, I'm so happy about what God is doing, because for decades I knew there was something more and I just didn't know what it was. And now I realize that what's been missing is Jesus style disciple making, that now I'm making disciples in the way that Jesus did and others are too. And it's radically changing lives. And so that's the kind of transformation that we can see as we engage this process with commitment and a trust in God and what the Holy Spirit wants to do.
Well, that's great. Justin, thank you so much for being with us. I do want to encourage everybody who's with us live, or if you're watching the recording, to make sure that you download Justin's free book. It's a free ebook. You'll be blessed by it. You'll be encouraged by it. I also want to encourage everyone in the collective to notice the, looks like a classroom, and it's the Q&A sessions. And you'll see several weeks of sessions with disciple-making leaders there that you are free to watch. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And since this is being recorded in the holiday season, we pray God's blessings on you for Christmas and New Year. Thank you, everyone.